Batman is one of the most iconic superheroes out there, and it's pretty much been that way since his inception. Everyone knows about billionaire Bruce Wayne, who stalks the streets of Gotham at night, striking terror into the hearts of the wicked. But until 2009, nobody had really managed to capture the awesome power of Batman in video game format. Sure, there had been plenty of Batman games up to that point, but a lot of them were mediocre to downright bad. And even aside from that, I don't feel like any of them really managed to showcase why people are so drawn to Batman. But then came Rocksteady's Batman: Arkham Asylum, part stealth game, part fast-paced action brawler that took the world by storm, being widely regarded at the time as not only the best Batman game, but the best superhero game in general. I played through the game myself back in the day and absolutely fell in love with it and its sequels. But of course, you know me by now. I wanted to go back to this iconic series of games to see what makes them tick, to see how the series grew and changed over its 6-year lifespan. So please, join me as we take a look at the evolution of the Arkham series. But real quick, if at any point you think I'm doing a good job, please consider leaving a like and subscribe if you like the content. It really does help me out. Also, Twitter and Discord links are in the description. Check them out. Alright, enough of that, let's get into it. So, one short disclaimer. I won't be touching Arkham VR for this video. For my Evolution series, I like to stick to mainline entries and avoid spin-offs. Besides, I'm pretty sure that Arkham VR isn't even canon. Also, there will be spoilers for all 4 mainline games. Alright, got it? Good. Introductions are an important thing. They get the audience interested, excited, and informed. And in this case, Arkham Asylum's intro is pulling double duty. It's not only introducing the game, but the entire series. We start off in the titular Arkham Asylum, which is where they keep the criminally insane Batman villains. Joker has just had his plans foiled, and Batman is there to make sure the processing goes smoothly. This is all done via what is essentially an interactive cutscene. You're just continually walking forward as the Joker, voiced by the legendary Mark Hamill, essentially introduces himself to the player, cracking jokes, messing with prison staff, and not so subtly hinting that he has something planned. I'm of two minds about this whole sequence. On the one hand, it's a fucking phenomenal character introduction. Even after years, I still remembered that intro sequence fondly, and honestly, if this were a movie, I'd have no complaints. But it's not a movie, it's a video game. And while I still very much like the opening, it's not exactly the best for a repeat playthrough. See, while it genuinely does do an amazing job of setting up the Joker and the central conflict of the game, you're essentially locked into this extended, non-skippable cutscene before you get a chance to be part of the epic power fantasy that is Arkham Asylum. And I found myself getting a little antsy waiting for the scene to end so I could just start being badass already. The scene goes on for just around 9 minutes, which may not sound like a lot, and it wouldn't be a lot if it were a movie, but going 9 minutes in a game before you can even start the tutorial can be pretty rough. So to make a long story short, a bunch of Joker's crew were temporarily relocated to Arkham Asylum due to a fire in Blackgate Prison. Joker is then able to organize a takeover of the place with the help of his guys, a corrupt guard, and none other than Harley Quinn. It's revealed that he let himself be caught easily just so he could set this whole scenario up and continue his little game with Batman. At this point, the game does exactly the right thing and immediately throws Batman into a combat scenario. Okay, so when I do these Evolution videos, I usually like to structure them almost as extended reviews, but I think I'm going to do things a little differently here. Instead of going on about visuals, I want you to just look at the video. Instead of going on about the music, which admittedly slaps way harder than it needs to, just listen to the epic orchestral backing to this video. Hey, future ads here, just want to make a quick correction. Turns out all the music is actually copyrighted, so I'm not including it in the video. Sorry about that. Because let's be real here. The bread and butter of the Arkham series is its gameplay, and I want to jump right into it. Arkham Asylum popularized a style of third-person brawler that I often call the free-flow combat system. The way it works is that as you hit enemies, you build up a combo. On the third hit, you will enter free flow mode, where your attacks will make you snap to enemies even over great distances. Your hits will deal more damage, and you'll be guaranteed to knock down all but the largest unarmed enemies. At the start of the game, it's extremely simple. Press one button to attack, another to counter when the blue indicator lights up, and comboing 8 hits and/or counters will allow you to perform a special combo takedown, which will immediately knock out an enemy. Afterwards, you can charge it up again with another 8 moves. As you might imagine, going too long without building the combo or taking a hit will break the combo, resetting it to 0. The key to success in this system is to get into a proper rhythm, and instead of focusing on one enemy at a time like most group combat systems, you jump from enemy to keep the combo going. As the game progresses, combat will get a little more complex. For a start, you'll be taught that you can use batarangs to stun and knock down enemies, and once you unlock the Bat Claw, you'll be able to use it to pull and stagger enemies. You'll also be able to unlock a variety of new moves. One of these new moves is a throw ability which requires a charged combo, so you'd use it in place of the combo takedown. New enemies will also be introduced as time goes on. Some enemies will carry blades which cannot be blocked normally. Instead, you must hold the block button for the duration of their combo to evade it. Enemies holding a shield need to be stunned, at which point you can roll in their direction to perform an aerial attack, knocking them over. Enemies with stun sticks require you to evade over their head, at which point there will be a short window to hit them in the back. Both shields and stun stick enemies cannot be attacked normally from the front, and you also can't counter their attacks, only evade. After a while, you'll occasionally start running into Titan enhanced enemies, and I'll get into what that means when I talk about story later on. These guys are almost like a step above regular enemies, but a step below a mini-boss. They can throw shit at you, and when they charge at you, hitting them with a batarang will cause them to run into the wall. At certain health thresholds, you can ride them, which will cause them to flail around wildly, damaging other enemies in the area. As the game slowly opens up, combat becomes more and more complex, and you'll need to keep more things in mind while still maintaining that rhythm and quick thinking to keep dealing damage and avoid taking damage. And in that same vein, I'd like to talk about two unlockable skills that I feel add a really satisfying level of reward for skill. The first is the simpler option, critical strikes. Basically, if you press the attack button immediately after landing an attack in free flow, your next attack will deal double damage and increase your combo by 2. This effectively allows you to shorten the window of time you have to react in the middle of combat, but in exchange you get to be more powerful in combat. The next skill is the blade dodge takedown. When you execute a blade dodge, the enemy will be swinging at you a few times over a few seconds. Well, if you have the blade dodge takedown unlocked, you can release the counter button in between swings, and at the end of the attack, you'll immediately knock out the attacking enemy, almost like you did a combo takedown on them. Of course, if you mistime it, you risk getting sliced up. I really like systems like this that encourage risk versus reward without explicitly requiring it. The blade takedown especially is great because it really does require a lot of timing and concentration relative to the general flow of combat, but you're seriously rewarded for it. Both in the fact that you immediately take down an enemy without using up a charged combo, but in challenge mode arenas, it's an incredibly high scoring ability. And don't worry, I'll talk about challenge mode later on. But at the same time, you absolutely don't have to take on this extra difficulty and complexity if you don't want to. And in fact, I'd say you're encouraged not to do so if your skills just aren't there, because you'll take damage and lose your combo. There's a reason that the combat in Arkham Asylum is so iconic. Even as the first of 4 games, it's extremely satisfying and manages to strike that balance between a moderate challenge and the power fantasy of being fucking Batman. That being said, it's not perfect. The animation cancel when performing a counter is not the most consistent, and it can be incredibly annoying when you throw out an attack, the counter indicator lights up after the animation starts, and you can't do anything about it, leading to you getting hit. This also slows down the pace of combat in a way that I don't think the developers wanted. Instead of keeping on bopping all the time, when surrounded by enemies, I would often take my time because I knew that I wouldn't always be able to counter if the wrong enemy attacked me at the wrong time. When you're down to the last few enemies, it's not always clear at which point in their knocked down and getting back up animation they can be hit by a regular attack and what portions require a ground takedown, meaning it's very easy to lose your combo at the very end of a fight. Not the biggest deal in story mode, but it means you'll be missing out on bonus points in challenge arenas. Sometimes when fighting a group of enemies, they'll naturally get spread out as you're flying around and knocking them all over the place. Not an issue conceptually, but it's possible for them to spread out further than you could travel in a free flow strike, meaning you'll want to hit an enemy, but you'll just punch the air, breaking your combo. And the range is really not communicated to you at all. Groups of enemies also don't feel quite right because they just come at you one at a time like a superhero movie, and it feels kinda fake. And I also have to say that while I love most of the enemy types, I really hate the Titan enemies. They're not difficult by any means, but I feel like they interrupt the flow of combat and their presence dictates how the entire fight will go. The way they work is that they have a few attacks. They have a close range attack that's basically there to keep you from just continually wailing on them. They may throw things at you, and they have the charge attack I mentioned earlier. Batarang them in the charge and they'll run into a wall, taking significant damage. Well, the way they're designed, the best solution more often than not is to simply wait for them to charge, let them take the damage, and repeat until you can mount them. Continue until dead. It doesn't have that whole fast-paced, fly-around-the-room feel that the rest of the game has, which is where I feel the Arkham series is at its best. These issues I have don't make the game bad by any means. On the contrary, I think it's a great game, especially for its time. But even its best aspects are not perfect. The other main gameplay component is the Predator segments, where instead of blasting through groups of enemies, you're taking the stealthy approach against enemies armed with guns. As you can imagine, getting shot up with an automatic rifle or a shotgun will take you down a lot faster than fists and clubs, so you have to try to avoid being seen. Here, you can do the standard silent takedown where you sneak up behind the baddies and choke them out for a few seconds. But where it shines is in how many options you have to move around the room and different methods you can use to take the enemies down. Seriously, if you're just relying on silent takedowns for your entire playthrough, you're missing out. Almost every Predator map will have gargoyles that you can grapple up to, which allow you to quickly traverse the area and also escape if spotted. Maps will also usually have multiple levels of elevation, and many will have floor grates and or vents you can crawl through to hide and sneak up on enemies. You'll also have a chance to use your various gadgets to take down enemies. If you find a damaged wall, you can use explosive gel to make it go boom when an enemy is near. Once unlocked, you can sit on a gargoyle and grab an enemy walking beneath for an easy takedown. You can use your bat claw to pull an enemy off a ledge for an instant takedown. You can glide off a vantage point into an enemy, knocking them down, at which point they'll be vulnerable to a ground takedown. Though be careful because this takes a few seconds and the glide kick will alert other enemies. Looking back, this is all a little bare bones compared to the rest of the series, but it is a pretty solid stealth system at its core. As you progress through the game, there will be a few new challenges thrown in, such as enemies who set up explosives, trapped gargoyles that blow up if you hang around, enemies with night vision that can see you when perched on a gargoyle, and heart monitors which will alert everyone a few seconds after a takedown. Or occasionally, an enemy will grab a friendly NPC as a hostage and will shoot them if you're spotted, instantly failing the segment. Again, not as complex as the series would eventually become, but it's nice. And I have to talk about a feature that's present throughout the entire game, but is most important during these Predator segments. Detective vision. What this does is it basically acts as a thing highlighter. You'll be able to see through walls and will clearly be able to see enemies and any object you can interact with, such as a vent or a collectible. This lets you plan a course of action in Predator segments and reduces the chances of turning a corner and suddenly staring down the barrel of a boomstick. Now, any kind of enhanced vision ability in stealth games is something that has the potential to be a little too good. That being said, I feel like Arkham Asylum's Predator segments were balanced around detective vision, and even though it certainly is very powerful, I didn't get the sense that it makes the game too easy. Besides, due to the generally dark color palette of the enemies and the overall desaturated look of the game, the enemies don't exactly stand out among their surroundings, so that all leads me to believe that detective mode is 100% the intended way to play. I do enjoy how the Predator segments play out, though I will say I prefer the combat sections by a wide margin. It's a perfectly functional system and you have a lot of leeway with how you want to approach everything, but the combat is just better. When you're not in a combat or stealth scenario, you're usually in what I'm going to very loosely term the exploration section of the game. Arkham Asylum is not an open world game, but it does have a bit of openness to it. You'll mostly be going from point A to point B, but you'll be free to explore any of the areas you've already opened up. See, Arkham Asylum is its own small map with several different buildings and a fairly open area connecting them. You'll unlock new areas through certain story triggers, and as you unlock certain gadgets and upgrades, you'll be able to get to previously inaccessible areas. One example is the explosive gel. Once you get it, you can blow through weak walls and get to new places. Now, the reason you'll want to explore is because of the Riddler. See, Riddler has hidden tons of question mark trophies all around the asylum and has also designed several riddles where you need to find the answer in the world. Now, I don't think they really justify this bit well in the story. I mean, Riddler is taunting Batman, but he really has no reason to solve these riddles when there are far more pressing matters at hand. But whatever. Riddler effectively fills out the game with collectibles, and it keeps the game interesting. The trophies can be found all over the place. Some of them require you to navigate to little sections off the beaten path. Some are gated by certain gadgets or upgrades, Metroidvania style, and some are just right in front of your face. Every section also has a map, which is usually on a table or something out in the open. This map will mark the approximate location of every trophy on your map, though they do actually have a bit of an animation, so it doesn't tell you exactly where they are. They're a bit of a pain if you're going for all of them, but none of them are awful individually. The riddles are an interesting case. They're generally pretty easy to figure out and can point to some interesting little Easter eggs. For example, one of the answers is Black Mask's mask. But one thing I noticed is that oftentimes the riddle answers kinda stick out. I'll see something and I'll just feel like it has to be a riddle answer, so I check it without even knowing what the damn riddle is, and I'll be right. That does kind of take away from the clever fun of the riddles, but I don't think it could have easily been avoided without absolutely filling the game with Easter eggs and references, or completely shifting away from the concept of having nearly all the riddles point to something in Batman lore. It's not the biggest issue, but I do feel like it takes away from the potential fun of solving the riddle when you can just tell by sight that the thing in front of you is the answer to one riddle or another. These exploration segments are more or less filler to tide you over between the combat and Predator segments, and they give the illusion that the game is less linear than it actually is. It can be fun to just mess around, but I pretty much constantly found that I wanted to just move on to the next segment of the game already. Arkham Asylum also has a rudimentary level system. As you complete combat and predator segments, you'll be judged on your performance and granted experience points based on how well you did. You'll also get experience for finding collectibles and solving riddles. Each time you level up, you'll get an upgrade point and you'll be able to unlock some sort of new ability or upgrade. Some of them are pretty simple, like more health. Some, like the inverted takedown, give you more options to play around with in game, and one option is actually required for certain collectibles. It's all pretty simple and you'll likely be max level by the end of the game. I don't really have all that much to say about it. In addition to all that, there are a few segments where you have to overcome Scarecrow's fear toxin. It causes Batman to hallucinate and enter a false reality where he has to avoid the light-up gaze of a giant scarecrow. Not my favorite, but it's alright. And there are also crime scenes where you use a variant of detective vision which lets you isolate points of interest at specific story sections and will usually result in a trail of something. Maybe it's chemical residue, maybe it's fingerprints. This leads you to where you need to go to progress the game. These sections aren't bad per se, but I didn't really care for them and I just wanted to get them over with as quickly as possible. And that brings me to one of the problems I have with the game on a structural level. As I mentioned already, I feel like the game absolutely shines in its combat and predator segments, but looking back at the game in its entirety, there wasn't actually all that much combat and stealth, or at least not nearly as much as I personally would have liked. Now, the significant combat and predator encounters were actually pretty spaced out when you consider the time spent moving from point A to B, various story segments including cutscenes, scarecrow toxin sequences, and it extends even further if you're doing even basic collectible hunting. Fucking forget it if you're reading and listening to all the lore dumps. Now, I think it's a sign of something good when one of my biggest gripes about gameplay is, I want more, but that doesn't negate the fact that I genuinely think Arkham Asylum would have been so much better if they just let Batman be a badass more. But, all that being said, these issues are kinda sorta resolved by challenge mode. See? Told you I'd talk about it. Challenge mode is neat because it strips away everything aside from what makes Arkham the best fucking Batman games on the planet. You choose a combat arena and fight, or a predator encounter and sneak. If you've beaten the game and just don't have the desire to do another playthrough but really want to beat the crap out of some people, this is what you want. Challenge mode also does something the campaign kind of tries to do but doesn't really succeed at. It encourages you to outright master its systems. In the combat challenges, you'll be scored based on your performance in each of the waves of enemies. That combo counter? Well, it's now a multiplier, meaning your score will rack up immensely if you manage to keep it going. Using a variety of techniques and gadgets in combat will give you bonus points at the end of the round, as will not taking damage and completing the wave in a single free flow, with a sizable bonus if you do the entire arena without taking damage. And at the end, you're graded between 0 and 3... Okay, well, they're bat symbols, but I'm just gonna call them stars. You earn the stars at different point thresholds, so you have a target to shoot for, and a baseline for how much you need to improve to really master the game. The predator challenges are the same kind of deal, where they throw you into a predator encounter and you've just gotta take out all the baddies. The main difference here is that there's not a scoring system, but instead you'll have 3 optional challenges to complete. Each one is worth a star, and you'll have to do all 3 challenges in one go to get the 3 stars. Usually these challenges will revolve around getting specific types of takedowns or giving you some sort of limitation you have to work around. At the end of the challenge, your time is recorded, which you can compare to your best attempt. The way your best is calculated is simple. First, it checks for number of stars. A 3-star run will always be considered better than a 0 to 2-star run. Then it checks for time. So your best run is simply your fastest run at the highest number of stars you've collected. The thing I like about challenge mode is not only the fact that you get to beat the shit out of people, but I like how it really takes the combat and stealth mechanics to another level. You don't have to be particularly amazing at either to get through the game with no issues. As long as all the baddies are on the ground, that's good enough in the campaign. But in the challenges, you have to keep that combo going, use your different abilities, switch up your takedowns. And there are enough of these challenges that you have a lot of new content to play around with if that's what you want. Now, I don't envy the hardcore completionists who play the Arkham games, but I think challenge mode was exactly what Arkham Asylum needed. So now, let's talk a little bit about the story of Arkham Asylum. I'm going to give you a quickie overview of the entire story, though I'm not really going to explain the deal with the various Batman villains that show up. If you really want to learn more about them, you can search that out for yourself. Joker's getting admitted to Arkham Asylum, accompanied by Batman and a few guards at the start of the game. Many of Joker's crew are here due to a fire at Blackgate Prison. Joker soon escapes with the help of Harley Quinn and a guard he's paid off, the latter of which kidnaps Commissioner Gordon. Batman then has to figure out how to regain control, but he doesn't get any police help since Joker threatened to blow shit up in Gotham if anyone else shows up. Batman eventually runs into Scarecrow, who drugs him up. Batman then tracks down Harley Quinn and saves Gordon and moves on, where he finds and fights Bane. At this point, he starts to learn what Joker's really planning. See, a doctor on the asylum, Dr. Young, has been experimenting with Bane's venom. She eventually crafted a modified version of it called Titan that basically makes anyone who takes it turn into the Incredible Hulk. But oops, turns out she was being funded by Joker, who got pissed when she tried to break off their agreement because he obviously wanted a rampaging army of Hulks. So Batman eventually has to rescue Dr. Young from Zsasz, but Joker kills her anyway and manages to nab the Titan for himself. Soon after, Batman learns from Poison Ivy that he can make an antidote for the Titan, but he needs to go down to Killer Croc's lair to find the necessary spores. When he gets back, Joker zaps Ivy with Titan and she basically starts Plant-Mageddon on the island, destroying Batman's stuff and only allowing him to make a single dose of the antidote. Batman rocks her shit and travels to the visitor center for the final confrontation with Joker. Batman blocks a Titan dart intended for Commissioner Gordon. Oh yeah, he got captured again. At this point, Joker really wants Batman to Hulk out, but he resists. So Joker tries to force his hand by shooting himself with Titan and turning into a massive monster. Batman refuses to transform, gives himself the antidote, and beats the ever-loving shit out of Joker, who afterwards turns back into normal, and all is well as the police retake the island. Okay, so now that I've condensed the story into around 2 minutes, and I really didn't leave much out, I have to say, narratively, it's okay, I guess. It works for the most part, but is certainly nothing special. I kinda feel like the actual plot serves more as a general backdrop and an explanation as to why Batman is in these situations in the first place. A justification for the gameplay. As an overarching story, it's honestly pretty mediocre. There's no real character progression, and the events of the world surrounding them are minimal. Honestly, it feels almost structurally like how a lot of the Silver Age comics were. There'd be this big conflict between the hero and villain, it'd get resolved, and everything would go back to normal as if it never happened. But while I didn't really care for the full picture, I did like the individual pieces to the puzzle. Specifically, I really did like the characterization at play. I mean, for starters, Mark Hamill as the Joker is absolutely phenomenal. He already had experience with the role in the animated series, and I think he honestly carries the entire voice cast on his back. Now look, I like Heath Ledger and Joaquin Phoenix's versions of Joker as much as anyone, but I always thought that Hamill really captured Joker's manic energy from the comics like no other. I also thought Harley Quinn was done pretty well. Honestly, she's a tough character to really get right. She's kinda ditzy, childish, and emotional, but not unintelligent. After all, she was a psychiatrist before going crazy. And while I won't say this is my favorite portrayal of her, I do think it's up there. Interestingly, I'm of two minds when it comes to how they handled Batman himself. There's almost 3 versions of him that exist in the game. The standard one you'll see is the cold, calculating figure, almost devoid of emotion. Most of his line delivery ends up like, "Oracle, I'm going to the place to stop the person." It's like they just animated a wooden board. Then there's the bits where he's actually a total badass in certain cutscenes, like the scene at the end where he fights off the Titan Venom and refuses to transform for the big fight against Joker despite the risks is fucking awesome. And then there's the scenes where he's dealing with Scarecrow's fear toxin, but before it fully transitions into the hallucination world with the giant Scarecrow, he sees all his biggest fears and regrets, all the darkness and negativity that he never really processed. At one point he hallucinates the death of Commissioner Gordon because he fears the idea of people he cares about dying because of him. He of course sees his dead parents and the guilt he feels about being unable to do anything to protect them. Not to mention that I don't think any iteration of Batman has ever properly dealt with the trauma of that event. These scenes are actually great. We actually get a chance to peel back the layers of this stoic and kinda boring personality to see what lies beneath. But unfortunately, these bits don't really mean anything in the long run. We don't see these experiences really affect Batman at all. There's genuinely stuff there, but they never really develop it. It's like it just goes away once these scenes are done, and I think that's a shame. It wasn't bad, but it could have been so much better. Overall, I think the story was decent enough for what it was, but it did leave me wanting something more. The minute-to-minute experience itself was pretty good, and I enjoyed the conflicts between Batman and the various villains. Still, I maintain that the story is not the best part of Arkham Asylum by a long shot. So Arkham Asylum is a pretty damn good game, and I can see why people reacted so positively to it on release. Of course, it's not perfect, but the foundations of its free-flow combat and the Predator stealth segments were truly great and were a great starting point for future games in the series to build off of. So with that, I think I've talked enough about the first game. Let's move on to Arkham City. Batman Arkham City is a direct sequel to Arkham Asylum, and the premise is that after the events of the first game, they basically needed to rebuild the asylum. But instead of doing it on the island, they just made the titular Arkham City mega prison in the middle of Gotham, and the former warden of Arkham Asylum, now mayor of Gotham, basically threw anyone even mildly criminal as well as those who spoke against him in there without trial. Batman began campaigning against this as Bruce Wayne, but during a speech he's kidnapped by mercenaries, and Warden Hugo Strange basically reveals two things right off the bat. He knows that Bruce Wayne is Batman and that he's the villain of the game. So your goal is to figure out what's going on and to fight various villains you'll come across. So what changed since the first? Well, let's look at the combat to start out. Right away, I have to mention that this absolutely does not translate to video, but everything feels so much smoother, and the ability to cancel animations for a counter is a little bit cleaner. It feels like I have to spend less of my energy working around the controls as the game kind of understands what I want to do. Again, you can't really see it from watching a video, so you'll have to take my word for it. Aside from that, two things you'll also notice almost immediately is that firstly, enemies will no longer just run at you one at a time. Now they can attack in groups of up to 3, and you'll have to press the counter button multiple times to account for it. Adds a little complexity and builds immersion. I'm into it. The other thing is that you can now counter objects thrown at you. It's functionally the same as countering a regular attack, but it just adds a little variety. Aside from that, they changed up the enemy types a bit. Most of the enemy types stuck around like shields, blades, and stun sticks, but they added in a few new types as well. There are enemies with body armor. To beat them, you have to stun them and then perform a beatdown attack, where you just start rapid fire beating the shit out of them. This can be interrupted by others, so make sure to dodge or counter before going back to punching. There are warriors from the League of Assassins who sort of act like blade enemies who can't drop their blades, except they can sometimes dodge your attacks and have a different, faster slashing attack than the standard blade enemies. Titan enemies got a rework. Now they're taken on by doing an ultra stun, which is where you hit 3 stuns in a row. Then you can do a beatdown before mounting them like Arkham Asylum. They're still a formidable enemy, but you can kind of work around them now, and more importantly, you don't have to wait on their behalf. I think that adding more enemy variety was a great call. I find it much more fun to deal with a bunch of different enemy types rather than the same like 4 or so. There are also more unlockable abilities this time, meaning you can do more in the middle of combat. I'm not going to go over every single one, but I do want to highlight one that I personally enjoy. Special Combo, Disarm, and Destroy. Remember how you could execute special moves once you built up your combo enough in Arkham Asylum? Well, this ability uses that charge. Instead of taking an enemy down, Batman will instead destroy their weapon, rendering it completely unusable. So let's say the enemy has a shield and you can do the standard move of an aerial attack to knock him down and make him drop it. Well, he, or any other unarmed enemy, can just pick it back up. Disarm and Destroy rectifies that problem. I personally loved using this ability, especially when enemies would pick up guns, which are an absolute pain in the ass during the combat segments. But yeah, there are other new abilities, but I think that was the most impactful. There are also new gadgets this time around, which, like most of your existing gadgets, can be used in combat, such as the Remote Electrical Charge, which zaps people as you can imagine, and the Freeze Grenade, which temporarily immobilizes enemies. The Predator segments are pretty similar to Arkham Asylum, though I'd argue they're a bit more polished. Detective Vision looks different in Arkham City, and I personally find it more visually appealing. You can still do all the standard takedowns, but you can also do things like perform a takedown through certain breakable objects. One of your new gadgets, the Disruptor, can disable enemy guns at range. Don't ask me how the fuck that works. So you can actually render some of your Predator enemies harmless, as they won't realize their guns don't work until they try to shoot you. There are now more enemy types, like the ones who will periodically place mines around the area. Now, these changes are all very nice, but I feel like the development of the Predator segments from Asylum to City falls more on the quality of life department as opposed to how the combat mostly just added on new layers. Also, I feel like the level design is just a bit more conducive to the Predator playstyle than it was in Asylum, though even after looking over my footage, I can't actually think of an objective reason for that. Honestly, I just think Arkham City feels like a better stealth game. So Arkham City did indeed improve on its core systems of combat and stealth, and that shouldn't be understated, but I think the biggest improvement actually came in the world. See, Arkham City became what the first game wishes it was: open world. Arkham Asylum was basically a linear game with goodies packed around. Arkham City actually lets you explore the prison, and most importantly, it actually has side content. Now, admittedly, the map is pretty small, but I don't think that matters too much as long as there's stuff to do. Of course, you still have all the riddles and trophies, but you also have breakable cameras and balloons that serve as alternate collectibles. And there will be missions that you can do for experience awards, such as taking calls from Zsasz and trying to quickly reach a new destination to keep him from killing his hostage, or helping Bane find canisters of Titan that were smuggled out of the asylum. Or maybe you'll want to do the augmented reality gliding challenges. Oh yeah, let me use that to pivot into what I think really makes the location of Arkham City feel so much better than the location of Arkham Asylum. There is much more of a focus on being able to traverse the environment in Arkham City. While you could glide around in Arkham Asylum, it was very bare bones and it mostly served as a way to get the game a little bit of verticality. Here, you're expected to use the glide to navigate, and it's greatly helped by the addition of the grapnel boost. The ability to latch onto ledges and pull yourself up has been upgraded to now pull you faster and launch you into the air when you reach your destination. This immediately puts you into a glide and gives you a nice little bit of speed to get you started. Furthermore, they encourage you to use your dive bomb in air to build and maintain speed over long distances. Of course, you could just keep chaining together grapnel boosts as well. I think this was a much needed change to the franchise, and it really makes it fun to move from point A to B when before it was tolerable at best. And now I want to talk about Riddler for just a bit, because they actually gave him a purpose in this game beyond "find all my collectibles, Batman, unless of course you're too stupid." Since Arkham City actually has side missions, that's how they implemented Riddler. Basically, he has a bunch of hostages and he's willing to tell you where they are if you play his games. But there will be times when he says, "Nope, you haven't done enough of my challenges yet. I'll tell you where the hostage is once you have." So this achieves two things. Firstly, you actually have a proper gameplay reward for finding these collectibles outside of a short audio clip of Riddler getting arrested, but also it really nicely allows you to attack the Riddler trophies and challenges in chunks. It's perfectly viable to do the Riddler side mission as much as you can and then go hunt for collectibles until you've done enough to trigger the next bit. It breaks up the grind quite nicely in my opinion. I have a tendency to avoid actively hunting for collectibles in Arkham games until the end, because I know there's a good chance I'll come across places that are inaccessible until I progress further into story. But then, by the time I'm ready to hunt them down, it becomes extremely monotonous because I'll probably have 80% of them or more to find. Having missions unlock in between hunting sections makes it suck a lot less. But I also have to mention another interesting change to Riddler. Instead of just finding a map in each section, you can now occasionally find enemies who glow green. These are Riddler informants. You have to eliminate any nearby enemies while keeping them awake. You can then interrogate them to add collectibles for certain locations on your map. It adds a nice bit of extra optional challenge to certain encounters, since you have to avoid hitting one specific enemy in combat, or you have to leave one for last in Predator encounters. Plus, I think it just makes more sense narratively than Riddler just leaving a map of all his secrets for you. But yeah, overall, Riddler sucks a lot less in City than Asylum. Arkham City is also the first game to offer a New Game Plus mode. Basically, the enemy configurations will be harder and the counter icons are disabled, so you have to rely on the enemy animations themselves. In exchange, you get to keep all your upgrades from the previous playthrough. It's a good, tough challenge if you're still left wanting more, though it's by no means insurmountable. Also, collectibles are actually shared between the regular game and New Game Plus, so you don't have to grab them all twice if you're a completionist, which is a really nice touch. Overall, I like that they added this. Another thing I want to talk about is the introduction. Now, I already talked about Arkham Asylum's intro. It's iconic, but it does hurt the replay value of the game, and in my opinion, it's too long for a game that really hinges on the actual gameplay. Arkham City's intro is a lot less memorable, but I think it does its job better. There's a short sequence of a cutscene and then effectively an interactive cutscene, but once you're free, it delivers tutorial and narrative together, and you get a lot of the exposition and world building as you learn about the mechanics of the game. I actually felt like I was engaged with the world as the game was introduced to me. And again, I think Arkham Asylum's intro would be absolutely stellar in a movie, but I honestly think that Arkham City does a better job to introduce itself as a game. Another new feature in Arkham City is the introduction of Catwoman as a playable character. The core gameplay is the same, but she has her own set of gadgets, different animations, she can crawl around on certain ceilings, and she has a timed pouncing minigame to get to ledges instead of Batman's grapnel gun. Hey, look at this takedown animation. You know why she only uses that takedown on bad guys? Because heroes don't do that. There are a few sections where you'll have to play as her, and in the overworld there are several points where you can switch between Batman and Catwoman. All the story content aside from the mandatory Catwoman sections can only be done as Batman, but the pink Riddler trophies can only be collected as Catwoman. There's one section of the game where after a Catwoman mission, she's got her loot, but Batman's in trouble and she needs to decide whether to leave or ditch the goods and help him. You can actually choose to leave, which results in a non-canon ending where she just fucks off before it rewinds back to the choice, and I find that hilarious. Now look, it's pretty neat to have another playable character in the actual campaign of an Arkham game, but I feel like Rocksteady couldn't figure out how much they actually wanted to include her. They decided to add Catwoman trophies all around the map, making the player spend time with her if they're going for full completion, but they failed to really integrate her into the game enough to make her more than just a walking checklist. When a great game drops a new playable character on you, it shouldn't be a fucking chore. It should be exciting. The Catwoman segments are fun on their own, but I feel like they really should have gone one of two directions. Either they should have kept her segments 100% isolated, or they should have made her a much more significant part of the game as a whole. As is, she's in a really unfortunate middle ground where she could have been amazing. Ultimately, I think Catwoman was a textbook example of a great idea implemented poorly. I like the boss fights in Arkham City a lot more. I still don't think they're anything special, but they're actually interesting and make you think outside the box. For example, the Solomon Grundy fight makes you spray explosive gel on these electrical things to stop him from regenerating. Or my favorite boss encounter in the entire series, the Mr. Freeze fight. This one is really cool because it's actually a boss fight done via a Predator encounter. In order to prime Mr. Freeze for a beatdown, you have to do some form of stealth takedown, except after each one he will adjust his strategy to make it impossible to use the same trick twice. For example, after a standard silent takedown, he'll start shooting little ice spikes from his back, meaning you can no longer sneak up on him. The encounter is a little clunky, but I absolutely love the concept and I had a great time with it. I'm not going to go through each and every boss, but while they do vary in quality and don't blow me away for the most part, I actually like them. So now I want to talk about the story. There are two intersecting plot lines that drive Batman forward here. The first is what I already mentioned. Hugo Strange has some sort of sinister plan known as Protocol 10 and he knows Batman's secret identity. The second occurs when Batman tracks down Joker to see if he knows about Protocol 10. Joker reveals that the Titan transformation from Arkham Asylum has just royally fucked up his blood and he's dying. So naturally, he manages to subdue Batman, gives him a blood transfusion, and reveals that he's sent samples of his blood off to every hospital in Gotham. So Batman now has to find or develop a cure to save himself and any civilian who got some of Joker's blood before it can be intercepted. Along the way, Batman confronts a variety of villains such as Penguin, Two-Face, Mr. Freeze, Clayface, and Solomon Grundy. Batman eventually helps Mr. Freeze, who was working on the cure, by obtaining a sample of blood from Ra's al Ghul, leader of the League of Assassins. The cure gets stolen and Batman confronts a surprisingly healthy Joker, but things go fucky when Protocol 10 is activated. Turns out that Protocol 10 was to just glass Arkham City and kill pretty much every criminal in Gotham all at once alongside a shitload of innocents. The disruption gives Joker the upper hand and he's about to kill Batman, but Talia al Ghul offers him immortality in exchange for sparing Batman. Batman stops Protocol 10 and it's revealed that Strange was actually working for Ra's al Ghul, who kills him for his failure. Batman then goes back to Joker and is doing his whole threatening thing, but Talia stabs him in the back. But as Batman is admonishing her, another Joker, this one still sick, takes advantage and kills Talia. Turns out, healthy Joker was actually Clayface. So there's another fight and in the end, Batman drinks the cure and Joker accidentally destroys the rest when he attacks Batman. This whole time, even since Arkham Asylum, Joker has been trying to get Batman to kill him, because that would mean he won their game. But in the end, Batman tells him he would have given him the cure, and the game ends with Joker fucking dying. Now, one thing I like about the story of Arkham City specifically is that with the introduction of actual side content, the world feels much more alive and the main conflict doesn't feel as self-contained as it did in Arkham Asylum. The first game was a great experience, don't get me wrong, but I feel it only really held that magic on a first playthrough, kind of a one and done deal. But Arkham City actually immersed me even though this was not my first time playing the game. Also, I remember when I first played the game, I was shocked that they were willing to kill off important characters to Batman lore. I mean, seriously? Fucking Joker died. He's like the main Batman villain and they killed him off in the second game. I appreciate that Rocksteady really did want to accomplish something with the Arkham series, and when I get into Arkham Knight, you'll see what I really mean. I feel like many people in their shoes would be hesitant to kill important characters for fear of fan backlash or how it could affect future installments. It takes some guts to kill arguably the most iconic Batman character after Batman himself. Not saying the story is a masterpiece or anything, but I definitely liked it a lot. Overall, Arkham City is an improvement over Arkham Asylum in just about every regard. The gameplay is more polished, the world is more fun to inhabit, and the story is a big step up in the grand scheme of things. There were a few slip-ups, like how they pretty much botched Catwoman, but I think you can't really ask for much more than what Rocksteady brought to a direct sequel. Now, let's move on to Arkham Origins. Batman Arkham Origins is the red-headed stepchild of the Arkham series, and it stands out in one major way. It is the only one of the four to not be developed by Rocksteady, but instead was done by Warner Bros. Montreal. My understanding is that Warner Bros., the publisher, wanted another Arkham game fast, but Rocksteady needed more time for Arkham Knight because they wanted it to be the best it can be. So Warner Bros. Passed the job off to their Montreal dev studio, who would take some of the code from Asylum and City to get a game out there relatively quickly. Rocksteady pretty much gave them free reign and were largely uninvolved except to give a few technical pointers here and there as they used a custom version of the Unreal 3 game engine. Also, due to the change in development location, they had to get an all-new voice cast, meaning no Mark Hamill sadly. Troy Baker, you did an alright job, but an impossibly high bar was set before you even took the job. As the name implies, Arkham Origins is a prequel. It's set in the early stages of Batman's career as a superhero, when he's still considered an urban myth by many. This is also before the police have begun cooperating with him, so there's an interesting dynamic there. The driving push of the story is that Black Mask has put a $50 million bounty on Batman's head, and there are 8 supercriminals in Gotham all trying to collect. Okay, real fast, I just want to say that Origins is also the only Arkham game that features a multiplayer mode, and it's completely separate from the main game. The thing is, it's completely dead, so I'm not going to talk about it at all in this video. Combat from City to Origins is very similar at its core. Let's be real here, the foundation of the Arkham combat system is really solid, and changing it up fundamentally would have been a huge mistake. That being said, Arkham Origins combat does have its own feel that's different from City, and you really can't understand what I'm saying without actually playing it. It just doesn't translate to video. And I do want to take a moment to apologize really quickly. For whatever reason, Arkham Origins specifically wasn't playing nice with OBS, so a lot of the footage I gathered is not great. I was completely unable to fix it, but the footage is at least partially usable. I'm going to try to select the best parts for the video, but just know that any weirdness, stuttering, frame dips, etc. are not representative of the game itself, just how it was in recording. So like the last game, Origins introduces a few new enemy types as its main innovation to combat. There's the Armored Enforcer, who is different from the regular armored enemies, who has to have his armor taken off via a beatdown before he can be beaten. There are martial artists who can't be beaten with a combo takedown, can do combo attacks, all of which have to be countered, can counter your attacks which you can then counter, and can also do an attack that requires you to press the counter button twice. And there are enemies who use a variant of Bane's Venom. These guys need to have their venom packs ripped off with a combo takedown before they can be damaged. You can build up a combo on them with a beatdown if there are no other enemies around. At this point, you know how I think. More enemy variety is always a good thing in my eyes, and I think that new enemy types introduced in Arkham Origins are pretty decent. I'm not the biggest fan of Venom enemies outright requiring a combo charge move, but that's ultimately a minor complaint. One big change to combat is the introduction of the shock gauntlets. In the main story, you fight the Electrocutioner a few times and eventually take his zappy fists for yourself. These things charge up as you deal damage in combat, and when they're fully charged, you can activate them, at which point you'll deal more damage and you can bypass whatever alternate attack requirements you'd need for different enemies. So for example, you can just punch, shield, and stun stick enemies instead of doing an aerial attack or jumping over them. When it comes to armored enemies, you will immediately enter a beatdown without having to stun them first. You can also unlock upgrades that will allow you to counter previously uncounterable attacks as long as the gauntlets are activated. I'm of two minds about this. On the one hand, it's pretty fun and all the sound effects and animations that go along with it are cool. It's always fun to just go fucking nuts in an Arkham game. On the other hand, I don't feel like the game ever really took this power spike into account. At basically any time, you can just plow through any group of enemies while this thing is up, and there's really no system in place to balance it out. It actually got to a point where a lot of times I purposefully didn't activate them because I was satisfied with the level of engagement I was having with the regular flow of combat. Honestly, I feel like it was an interesting idea, but I don't think it was fully fleshed out to the extent I would have liked. I mean, imagine if there were enemies who actually had a direct response to electricity. That would have made you actually think about where, when, and how to use it. People tend to judge Arkham Origins pretty harshly because it's the odd one out. It's not part of the main trilogy and it wasn't made by Rocksteady. But let's be fair here, the signature part of any Arkham game is the free flow combat system, and Arkham Origins does a pretty good job of it, and that should be recognized. The Predator encounters follow much the same trend as the previous game. The core is the same with a few minor things tweaked here and there, but most of what changes up the game is in level design and in one new significant gadget. The remote grapple is obtained after beating Deathstroke early in the game, and it attaches two things together with a kind of zipline thing. This can be used to create a tightrope over an area, and many Predator encounters do include places to set these up, but you can also attach certain items to enemies, pulling them together. In the case of a fire extinguisher, it'll smoke the area out, allowing you to wreak havoc for a few seconds. If it's something like a propane tank, it blows up in their face. Though luckily for them, it only knocks them unconscious. Because of course, right? A fucking explosion right next to your head is non-lethal, and Batman definitely doesn't kill. You could also make two enemies fly into one another, stunning them both for a few seconds. Also, I found that some of the default button maps for keyboard and mouse made a little more sense for Predator encounters than they did in Asylum and City. Namely, entering floor grates is now on spacebar instead of the middle mouse button, and dropping down is now on left control instead of the middle mouse button. Definitely a nice change, but ultimately inconsequential considering all the games have rebindable controls. The world itself is a bit of a departure from the rest of the series. Firstly, this is the first Arkham game to be set in Gotham proper, though admittedly it's only a small section of the city. Secondly, it's actually the only Arkham game to feature a fast travel system. See, I'm pretty sure some of the higher ups in Warner Bros. Montreal were Far Cry fans because each section of the map has a radio tower. If you can figure out a way in and hack the device inside, you'll unlock fast travel to that district via the Batwing. I'm gonna be perfectly honest, while I like doing shit to unlock other shit, the fast travel is pretty fucking useless. You can get pretty much anywhere on the map in only a few minutes at most, so I never really saw the point, especially since I could always just nab some collectibles or do some side quests along the way. In fact, I noticed that after completing my playthrough for this video, which makes it my second playthrough overall, I still did not have the achievement for using each fast travel point, and there aren't exactly a lot of them. I guess I can't fault the game for including them, but they weren't exactly helpful. Riddler features in Origins like the other games, but it's a little different here. Since this is before Batman had really established himself in Gotham, Riddler hadn't bothered to set up games for Batman because he really didn't care about him. But it just wouldn't be an Arkham game without Riddler trophies, so they take a different form: extortion data. See, Riddler had collected sensitive info about a number of characters in Gotham, from Commissioner Loeb, this is before Gordon was promoted of course, to the various villains. Once you collect all the data packs in a set, you'll get some lore and a nice little experience boost. There are also network relays scattered across the city. When you unlock a fast travel point, you'll also reveal these on your map. Destroy every relay in the city to gain access to Riddler's hideout where you can mess up his operations. Collect every data pack to enter his secret room and collect the one and only Riddler trophy for a hefty experience boost. A little anticlimactic, but it's whatever. For what it's worth, I did find it a lot less painful to hunt these down than it was in Asylum and City, and something in me actually made me want to do it, whereas I had to basically force myself in the previous games. Of course, the fact that there are no actual riddles in the game is a bit of a disappointment, but it's far from a deal breaker for me. While Arkham Origins was really only meant to be a stopgap to appease the fans while they waited for Arkham Knight, it did introduce one thing to the franchise that I think was fucking fantastic: an upgraded version of the little evidence scanning thing from the previous games. Here, as you scan points of interest, you can actually digitally reconstruct parts of the various crimes as they happened. To be clear, it's not a puzzle or anything, you're not actually seriously using your brain here, but for the first time you actually feel like you're living up to Batman's reputation as the world's greatest detective. Punching baddies is always great, but one of the things that always made Batman exciting is the fact that he's really fucking smart, and these segments really do highlight that. That being said, I'm glad they don't overstay their welcome. They're a very welcome distraction as a way to advance the story section without showing up all the time, and there's a series of side quests that let you examine more crime scenes, so I think they were implemented quite well into the overall game. There's another system unique to Arkham Origins, and that is a series of gameplay challenges which reward you with experience and upgrades. There are 4 sets of challenges, and you can do any one of the 4 at pretty much any time, but you must do each challenge in each set sequentially. And as you might imagine, they get harder as they go on. It's a nice little system, though I don't feel like the rewards were really worth it. Also, some of the Predator challenges were annoying because it was very easy for encounters to simply not be compatible with certain challenges. For example, one challenge required me to do a vent takedown, a corner takedown, a ledge takedown, and an explosive gel takedown in a single encounter. Well, fuck me if my next encounter doesn't have any events, whereas most every combat challenge can be done in pretty much any fight as long as the group of enemies is big enough. Ultimately, these challenges were just another thing to do, but you're not really any worse off for ignoring it. Like Arkham City before it, Arkham Origins has a New Game Plus mode with the same kind of deal. Tougher enemy configurations and no counter icons with collectibles shared between game modes, and you get to keep all your upgrades. However, once you complete New Game Plus, you unlock I Am the Knight. This is basically another New Game Plus run, but with permadeath. I'm not a huge fan of this due to the fact that it's not actually any harder, just more punishing. Also, there are a few specific encounters that are a major pain in the ass with no counter indicators. The one that immediately comes to mind is the fight with Copperhead. It's hard to tell if some of her attacks require a regular counter or a blade dodge. It's just not obvious from her wind-up animations. But it's not like my experience was any worse because this game mode exists. Also, you can actually kind of cheese the permadeath by hitting the restart button before you die. It'll send you back to the last checkpoint, but that's better than losing all your progress. I personally would have preferred to see a full-on fuck you mode where the game pushed you to your limits and made you truly master its various systems, rather than just copy-pasting New Game Plus and adding permadeath. Oh well. The boss fights are like the rest of the series. Not too terrible, but nothing special either. I'd say they're about on par with Arkham City, though I did personally find the fight with Deathstroke to be a lot of fun. I'm not going to go on about them because honestly, it's all pretty par for the course as far as Arkham bosses go. Now, before I move on from gameplay, there is one thing that I think really deserves a mention. There's another thing that sets Arkham Origins apart. From my experience playing all 4 games over, Origins was by far the buggiest. Nothing particularly game-breaking, but there was always some oddity around the corner. When I boot up the game, the audio on all the logos crackles. Enemies would sometimes just fly into the air instead of dropping to the ground. There was one point where my audio completely cut out until I moved on to the next section of the game. A few times, Riddler informants just refused to be interrogated, and I'd have to leave the area so the group could all respawn and I could try again. Sometimes gliding would just loop the beginning of the animation over and over, making it look like Batman was doing the worm. I got stuck in the environment a few times. Occasionally, you can get caught on something when trying to grapple up to a ledge. One of the challenges randomly completed itself when I didn't meet the requirements. There were just bugs all over the place, and I get that this team was inexperienced with Arkham, but that's no excuse to release a game as unpolished as this. And even so, why hasn't any of this shit been patched in the 8 years since release? It's just sloppy, and it hurts the presentation of the final product. Now for the story. There are parts I really like and parts I don't really care for as well. The main thing I disliked about the story was a trap that many prequels tend to fall into. See, we as the audience have the benefit of knowing what happens after the events of this game, assuming we've played Arkham Asylum or Arkham City. So there are instances where the game will put certain characters in danger to try to build tension, but it utterly fails because unlike a standard non-prequel, the future is not obscured. When then Captain Gordon is in danger, you're supposed to be anxious because he's a likable character, not just in Arkham, but in all of Batman lore. But he shows up in the other Arkham games, so we know he ends up fine. I don't think the writers were fully equipped to handle the very specific difficulties that come with writing a prequel, and to be fair, it is difficult, but these guys are pros. They should be able to handle it. All that being said, the writers did get to explore a very interesting dynamic that the other Arkham games simply couldn't do. This is essentially Batman's introduction to pretty much everyone in the Arkham universe. This game introduces Batman to Joker and shows how Joker's obsession with Batman specifically came to be. You get to see the different ways the various villains treat Batman before they've built up a mutual repertoire. For example, it's neat to see Deathstroke first address Batman condescendingly and then begrudgingly give some respect for his combat prowess as their fight proves to be less one-sided than he anticipated. Plus, it's got the other Arkham staple of having a bunch of villains, big and small. Throughout the main and side missions you'll encounter Joker, Black Mask, Copperhead, Bane, Deathstroke, Electrocutioner, Shiva, Penguin, Anarchy, and more besides. I don't think it was anything groundbreaking, but it was fine. I feel like this story was more of an exhibition of various origin stories than a true traditional narrative. Though I will say that when the story of multiple assassins was introduced, it kind of implied that there would be a segmented series of objectives to take each one down, but a few of them just went out like chumps and it was ultimately a much more linear main story path than I initially expected. Not ideal, but it's whatever. So that's Arkham Origins. A lot of people dislike it and I kinda see why. It's different from its peers in many ways, wasn't made by the developers everyone idolized, but at the same time it pretty much followed the formula for the most part. But honestly, I think it's a perfectly fine game in its own right, and it served its purpose of keeping the players happy until Rocksteady was ready to release their coup de grace, Arkham Knight. Batman Arkham Knight is a very interesting case. To me, one thing is abundantly clear. This is the most ambitious Arkham game. I mean, the opening line comes from Commissioner Gordon. This is how it happened. This is how the Batman died. Already setting up some heavy shit. So here's the thing. Rocksteady wanted this to be their best project yet and they put their all into it. Fans were expecting the world from this game, but did they do it? And how did they improve on their already fantastic series of games? Let's take a look. Now, if you were paying attention back when this game first came out, you'll note that the PC port was broken to the point of being nearly unplayable. The game has since been fixed and it's fine. I'm not going to really hold it against the game because I'm analyzing it as it exists today, but I do think that it's a black mark on Rocksteady's and Warner Brothers' record and it should be acknowledged. Don't ship out a broken product for fuck's sake. The combat system, as you might expect, shares its foundation with the rest of the series, and if you've played the others, you'll know the basics of what you're getting into. But I have to say, I think the combat in Arkham Knight really does step it up a notch. Firstly, I know I haven't really talked aesthetics in this video, but I have to mention how meaty the sound design is in this game. Where the other games had this nice satisfying thuds, Arkham Knight's combat has these weighty crunches, and while it's ultimately down to personal preference, this really made me feel the power of Batman a lot more and it made me more immersed in the combat. Like the other games, there are new enemy types to play around with. The general concept of body armored enemies is replaced by big enemies who are more visually distinct. Also, some of these big guys will have weapons, and a few will even change them up over the course of the fight. For big guys with a shield, you can actually prime them for a beatdown with an aerial attack instead of the standard stun, which is pretty neat. They also introduced medics, which I think add a lot to these fights. These guys can obviously revive fallen enemies, but they can also charge other enemies with electricity, meaning you can't hit them or counter their attacks. Instead, you need to hit them with your bat claw to dispel the electricity. Enemies can also charge at you and can be taken out in one hit by tossing a batarang at them as they're coming at you. And of course, your various gadgets play into things as well. You now have a projectile variant to your explosive gel you can use in combat. Your disruptor can damage weapon crates as well as the guns themselves, and you can destroy stun sticks with your electrical charge. You can also do plenty of special takedowns with the environment, like pulling an air conditioner on someone's head or smashing them through a table. This is also the only Arkham game where you can actually pick up the melee weapons that enemies use, like wooden sticks or lead pipes. For a short time, you'll deal extra damage and be able to damage enemies with weapons without first setting them up. Of course, after a few hits it'll break, and there are a limited number at each fight, so it's not overpowered or anything. You can also do special takedowns with the Batmobile, but I'm giving the Batmobile its own section, so I'll talk about it then. And one of the most awesome new features is the ability to fight alongside one of Batman's allies. Okay, you can only really do this in certain sections, but it's cool nonetheless. Basically, Batman will be fighting alongside Robin, Nightwing, and Catwoman at various points, and they'll kind of be doing their own thing while you're fighting. However, with a button press, you can switch between the two at will, and they do play differently even though the core controls are the same. Furthermore, you'll fill this additional meter whenever you're fighting with a friend, and when it fills, your next switch will be accompanied by the two working together to beat the ever-loving shit out of some poor baddie. I know that the dark, brooding loner has been the popular portrayal of Batman in the modern day, but throughout Batman's history, he's always had allies, and it's cool to see them by his side here. The Predator segments are really something else. Certain new additions to the game really change up how these encounters can go. For starters, medics can also appear, so you'll need to either take them out early or let them use up all their heals. There are also drone operators who control drones, which are a massive pain in the ass. Take out the operator and the drone crashes. There are enemies who do not light up with your detective vision, but stand out when it's off, meaning you don't want to keep detective vision on all the time. Some enemies can track your location if you keep detective vision on for too long. There are new minigun enemies who not only fucking hurt if they catch you, but can only be taken out by an extended beatdown or with a powerful takedown like exploding a wall. And one of the things enemies can do now is place sentry guns once you've scared them enough. These are another hazard to contend with, though you do get a way to blind them temporarily, and you can destroy them if you get behind them. But that's not even all. One of the brand new abilities to Arkham Knight is the Fear Multi-Takedown, which allows you to basically chain together fast takedowns of up to 3 or 5 enemies, depending on how much you've upgraded it. This is amazing for taking out a group of enemies, though you have to charge it back up with silent takedowns. As a side note, you can also use this to start out some combat scenarios as well. And of course, you have some new goodies to play around with that affect stealth, but I only want to talk about one that changes things up to a ridiculous degree: the voice synthesizer. Once you unlock this bad boy, you can actually tell enemies to go places so you can lure them into traps or even just separate groups of enemies. Of course, they'll stop listening to you if you use it too often to keep it from being overpowered, but this is a really neat system that allows for so much more control over a predator situation. In previous games, I was often just waiting for enemies to walk where I needed them to go, especially in challenge mode where I'd have to take people down in specific ways. With the voice synthesizer, I can cut down on that idle waiting time, and I love it. On top of all that, they really cleaned up the corner takedowns, which was one minor gripe I had throughout the entire series but had just learned to accept. Before, corner takedowns basically required you to be right up against the baddies, and a lot of times would be a little awkward to get into position. Also, Batman would always go around the corner for the takedown instead of pulling the enemy to him, potentially giving himself away. In Arkham Knight, not only does Batman actually pull enemies to him when doing a corner takedown like every other stealth game ever, but when enemies aren't within arm's length but still kinda close, he'll use his Batclaw to pull them over, allowing for a bit of extra freedom. I absolutely love this. I'll be honest with you, I always thought that the Predator encounters, while certainly enjoyable, lagged behind the combat. I mean, in my time, I've played other stealth games with systems I personally found much more satisfying, and I just didn't think it was quite as groundbreaking. But they improved Predator so much in Arkham Knight, and that's something I don't really see enough people give it credit for. Sure, the older games had perfectly functional systems, but I didn't enjoy them nearly as much. In Arkham Knight, I was actually looking forward to them. So now, let's talk about the billion-dollar elephant in the room: the Batmobile. A lot of people have some very strong opinions about it, and to be fair, I do see why. But I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian and say that I actually like it. Does it hold up next to the free flow combat system and Predator stealth system? No, not in the slightest. But I don't think it's bad. And here's the thing, I think Arkham Knight needed the Batmobile one way or another. One of the things I found really neat about the Arkham series as a whole is that it showcases a very large portion of Batman's extended universe. Just about every major Batman thing is in Arkham. I mean, even fucking Calendar Man has a cameo in Arkham City. If the Batmobile didn't have some sort of significant feature in the series, it wouldn't have really felt complete. It's the Batmobile, it's iconic. But putting that all aside, let's talk about it as a feature in the game. The Batmobile serves several different functions. The first is pretty obvious. It gets you around the city in what's known as pursuit mode. This prioritizes speed and has a pretty floaty movement scheme. When driving around, there's really no weight to the car whatsoever. This makes it actually very easy to control, but not as satisfying or as complex as something from a dedicated racing game. It's probably going to be mostly personal preference as to whether you prefer the Batmobile or gliding to get around. I used a mix of both depending on the nature of where I wanted to go and what things were available for me to do along the way. The next function is the one that I think made people get annoyed: battle mode. Throughout the course of the game, you'll be fighting a metric shit ton of unmanned tank drones. By holding a certain button, you can go into a battle mode where you'll have access to a machine gun which can destroy enemy sensors for an insta-kill, a cannon which can be used to deal high amounts of direct damage, and a variety of special attacks such as an area of effect stun or a barrage of missiles. Now, I think some of the reason I didn't mind fighting in the Batmobile as much as others is the fact that I actually play Arkham with the keyboard and mouse, and I know a lot of people use the controller. Now, the default input you need to hold for battle mode with keyboard and mouse is the right click. That's easy. I've been heavily using right click for ages. First and third person shooters hold down right click to aim, and plenty of other games utilize it heavily as well. On a controller, the default is the left trigger. Holding that down all the time has to be a massive pain in the ass. The combat itself is pretty simple. All enemy attacks are telegraphed and you just have to avoid getting hit. You have a ton of control in battle mode, while methodically taking down the enemies, either by blasting them open with your cannon or breaking their lenses with well-placed machine gun fire. I'll be the first to admit that this gets very samey very quickly. Once you get the combat down, you're never really challenged no matter how many combat segments you go through, and you go through a whole fucking lot. Throughout the story, there are plenty of drone combat segments, like way more than there really should have been. And one of the side missions is basically just a long series of drone combats all around Gotham. There are also these weird-ass stealth segments with the Batmobile. See, one of the drone enemies are the Cobra drones. These guys have armor that's too thick for your cannon, so you have to sneak up behind them, get a lock on their exhaust port, at which point you can take them down with a single shot. The explosion will then alert nearby drones, so you've got to book it. Not gonna lie, these segments got pretty fucking boring after a while. They were just way too easy for the time investment. It's kind of a shame, really. These sections of combat in the Batmobile aren't terrible, but they're nowhere near as crisp and fun as the bread and butter of the Arkham series, which is the free flow combat and the stealth. The car combat really overstayed its welcome, and I don't think people would have been as upset if Rocksteady had pulled back on the drone combat in the story and offloaded it into challenge mode, so people who really enjoyed it could seek it out at their leisure. The Batmobile can also help you in close quarters combat, almost acting like a teammate in that it can charge up a special takedown where you throw an enemy in the air for the car to shoot him in the head. Non-lethally, of course. There are also puzzles designed specifically with the Batmobile in mind, from story missions that use it to bypass or destroy obstacles, give you new angles to work with using the winch, and so on, to little puzzles where you can manipulate the environment to find a Riddler trophy. These segments are definitely very novel, and I don't hate them, but I'm not blown away by them. That being said, the puzzle variety is much greater in Arkham Knight than previous games, and you won't find very many instances where two puzzles will have the same solution, which was an issue present in the other games. One area I feel that Arkham Knight really shines is in its world. Arkham City's biggest strength as a sequel, in my opinion, was how it managed to give you a bunch of things for Batman to do in his quest to protect Gotham, as opposed to how Arkham Asylum was more or less a linear path to the end, with the asylum itself serving as mere backdrop. Arkham Knight takes this idea and goes to fucking town with it. There are tons of things to do, enemies to fight, and people to save all over the place. Every game since City had a Gotham's Most Wanted system that would kinda keep track of all the villains you have to take down in the game. But Arkham Knight's is the most in your face about it, with progress bars shown right in the menu and each bit of progress awarding upgrade points. And one thing that's interesting is that the ending of the game is actually locked behind Gotham's Most Wanted. In addition to completing the main storyline, you have to fully complete 7 of the 14 quests. An extended version of the ending cutscene is locked behind completing all 14. I'm gonna run through these missions very quickly, just the basics. City of Fear is the main questline where you have to stop Scarecrow in his plan to release fear toxin into Gotham, helped by the mysterious Arkham Knight. More on all that when I talk about story later on. The line of duty centers around a group of firefighters who are overrun and captured by rioters. You must rescue them. The perfect crime involves you tracking down a mysterious serial killer who turns out to be Professor Pig. Riddler's revenge is an interesting one. He's captured Catwoman and strapped a bomb collar on her like he's a wannabe Jigsaw. They must go through a series of trials such as race courses, Batmobile puzzle sections, and combat against color-coded robots. Afterwards, Riddler can be fought in his mech suit, but only once you've collected every trophy and solved every riddle. Own the Roads, Occupy Gotham, Armed and Dangerous, and Campaign for Disarmament all involve the Arkham Knight's militia forces, who are taken over by Deathstroke once the Knight is beaten in the main story. These involve clearing out watchtowers and checkpoints of enemies to destroy them, chasing down armored vehicles in the Batmobile, and doing drone combats to disarm bombs that have been placed around the city. Once this is all done, you fight Deathstroke in a fucking Cobra sequence. Man, what a waste of one of the best Batman villains. Creature of the Night has you tracking down and attempting to cure Man-Bat of his shocking transformation. Heir to the Cowl involves Azrael, who seeks to become Batman's successor. Batman puts him through combat trials and eventually discovers that Azrael has been brainwashed. Eventually, you'll have the choice if Azrael attempts to kill Batman or not. If he does, Batman beats him and locks him up. If not, he goes away to pursue those who brainwashed him. Gotham on Fire involves putting out fires started by Firefly and then chasing him down in the Batmobile. Gunrunner involves placing trackers on vans owned by Penguin in order to follow them back to his weapons caches so you can destroy them before confronting him directly. Two-Faced Bandit involves you stopping bank robberies that are being done by the crew of, you guessed it, Two-Face. Friend in Need is a short segment where Hush takes Wayne Enterprises CEO Lucius Fox hostage and Batman must stop him. And lastly, Lamb to the Slaughter involves Deacon Blackfire, who's attempting to ritually murder reporter Jack Ryder. You basically just have to do a timed combat segment and that's it. I can't overstate how much more I like the side content in Arkham Knight. It actually feels like it matters, which is something I never really got from the other games, and it's not only because you get an extended final cutscene for doing it all. Something about it just makes you want to complete it, and I think that should absolutely be recognized. Okay, now let's talk story. Earlier in the video, I mentioned how the game starts off saying, "This is how the Batman died." Well, it also starts out with the Joker being cremated while Frank Sinatra plays in the background. So we've got two things going on. The total destruction of Batman's greatest villain, and a promise that one way or another, Batman will die, though at the onset you're not sure if that death is physical or metaphorical. So the main premise is that Scarecrow has demonstrated his latest fear toxin, a very potent one that causes people to start attacking everyone around them, distributed by air. Gotham is evacuated as he promises to gas the entire city. Shortly thereafter, two big things happen. Firstly, militia storm the city, led by a mysterious masked figure known as the Arkham Knight. All we really know about him is that he knows all of Batman's behaviors and tricks and that he really wants Batman dead. Secondly, Batman gets a healthy dose of Scarecrow's toxin at the chemical plant and he begins hallucinating none other than our dear pal the Joker. So there's our three central conflicts: the driving antagonist in Scarecrow, the personal rivalry of the Arkham Knight, and the internal conflict of the lingering effects of the toxin. Now, I'm not going to go point by point as far as the plot goes, but I do want to talk about several things the story does. Firstly, Arkham Knight goes further in its examination of character relationships than any of the Arkham games before it, and actually has identifiable subplots surrounding them. A lot of it stems from an instance early on where Batman is forced to watch as Barbara Gordon, Oracle, is dosed with fear toxin and kills herself. Now, aside from the obvious grief Batman feels throughout the story, not only from losing a close friend, but from it being done to get to him specifically, it serves as the driving conflict between Batman and both Commissioner Gordon, Oracle's father, and Tim Drake, the third Robin and Barbara's fiancé. Batman tells Commissioner Gordon what happened and he's understandably very upset. He basically cuts ties with Batman and goes off on his own. This breakdown of an established relationship is a cause of constant stress and a bit of anxiety as we don't know the fate of Gordon for a long time. I'll talk about the resolution of this plotline in a bit because it'll lead into another neat thing I want to talk about. Batman handles the situation with Robin differently. He decides to go against Alfred's advice and hide it from him. This creates a very interesting dynamic where on one hand, Robin isn't gonna freak out for the time being, but if he finds out from someone other than Batman, that would permanently break their relationship. Furthermore, the situation makes Batman push Robin away and keep him out of the action despite his wishes, which on its own causes strain in the relationship. This particular plotline doesn't come to a super satisfying resolution as a lot of the things pushing it forward are resolved elsewhere. A bit of a shame, but I did like seeing this dynamic at play. So let's fast forward and get back to Gordon. A lot of things happen and eventually Batman meets back up with Gordon as they go to confront Scarecrow. When they get to the roof of the building, one of the biggest reveals of the game happens. Scarecrow rolls out Barbara Gordon, who is very much alive. And long story short, the Commissioner was being extorted and he shoots Batman in his heavily armored bat symbol so as to not actually kill him. Scarecrow then breaks the deal and pushes Barbara off the roof and Batman saves her. All very neat, but not what I want to talk about. See, this shows that the Arkham Knight utilized a writing trope that's one of my personal favorites, and I know I've mentioned it on the channel before. The unreliable narrator. Essentially, when the focal perspective of the story cannot necessarily be trusted, it's considered an unreliable narrator, even if there's no actual narration. This could be from the narrator outright lying. It could be that a character has some sort of brainwashing or mental illness to the point where they themselves don't know the truth. I think a good example that's not actually a spoiler would be the film Memento, which utilizes convoluted time skips to omit context from certain scenes, oftentimes misleading the audience until more information is revealed later on. I absolutely love it when done well, and one thing I like about how Arkham Knight did it, even though it's not my favorite usage of the trope, is how it all seems obvious in hindsight. Batman's been hallucinating for almost the entire fucking game. Joker, a dead man, has literally been chilling beside him all the time cracking jokes. And don't worry, I'll talk about that whole thing. He gets to relive the injuries and deaths that happened to people around him in his past. Is it such a shock that Oracle's death was another hallucination? I absolutely love how it's both completely unexpected, but logically sound and is built on established facts set up all game. Arkham Knight is the only game in the series that seems to take its writing super seriously. It actually has a story to tell and uses deeper writing techniques than any of the other Arkham games, and I honestly don't think enough people acknowledge that fact. So what's the deal with Joker? He's not just a bit of comic relief like I initially thought. It goes a lot deeper than that, both as a narrative tool and as a plot device. Let's talk plot device first. Remember how Joker shipped his infected blood all over Gotham back in Arkham City? Well, not all of it was successfully intercepted. Batman has been able to track down the people who received his blood, and they're all turning into Joker. And if you remember, Joker infected Batman with his blood as well. Yes, he used the antidote to keep himself from dying, but is it a coincidence that the Joker is the one he's seeing? Also, as it turns out, the fear toxin actually accelerated the Joker transformation process, so Batman's got a time limit to solve everything before he has to lock himself away for everyone's safety. That's the plot device. It fuels tension and adds a bit more to both the difficulty of success and the stakes. As a narrative tool, we need to remember that Scarecrow's whole thing is fear. His toxin is designed to scare the shit out of his victims. And Batman's greatest fear at that moment is becoming the Joker, because he'll be able to cause so much more devastation than the OG ever could. So every time he gets exposed to the toxin, Joker gets stronger. I really like this as it allows Batman's internal struggles to mirror his external ones in a way that doesn't feel contrived. It's pretty nicely done. That being said, I'm not the biggest fan of how all this gets resolved. I mean, it's clever, but it didn't quite sit right with me. So towards the end, Scarecrow has hostages and he forces Batman to surrender himself. Scarecrow then unmasks him for the world to see. At this point, he gives him a big boy dose of the fear toxin, enough for Joker to take total control. So he starts cackling as Jokers want to do. Scarecrow's all, what the fuck, and doses him again. But this time, since Joker's in the driver's seat, he's the one who has to live his greatest fear, which we learn is being forgotten. He wants his mark on the world to be eternal, and Batman is able to exploit this newfound knowledge to lock Joker up in the deepest recesses of his mind, never to surface again. Like I said before, it's definitely clever, and to its credit, it feels very comic booky, which I do like. But it didn't really feel all that satisfying to me. But it's whatever. So now let's talk the Arkham Knight, and this is another instance where people have complaints, and for one, I actually mostly agree with them. See, towards the end of the game, it's revealed that the Arkham Knight is actually Jason Todd, the second Robin, presumed dead at the hands of Joker. This is treated as this huge reveal, and the plot itself definitely works within the overarching story, but there are a few issues. Firstly, if you're a fan of the comics, it was obvious as to who it was. Now, I'm not really that knowledgeable about the comics, but I could see it being disappointing to effectively have this big reveal spoiled by prior knowledge of the franchise, something which is otherwise rewarded via Easter eggs. Secondly, there's a point where we get a series of hallucinations showing Joker torturing and then fake murdering Jason Todd. On the surface, it seems like another one of Batman's literal guilt trips, but on reflection, it's given a lot more airtime than anything else. I think it's because Rocksteady wanted the idea of Jason Todd to stick in the player's mind, so even if you don't know anything about Batman, you know who he is and why he's important. Basically, they don't want you to forget him. However, the inflated presence they gave to him means that it becomes pretty obvious that it's more important than they're initially letting on. Put two and two together, and it's not all that surprising when Arkham Knight turns out to be Jason Todd. I mean, I was able to figure it out when I first played through the game, and I don't have a particularly great knowledge of Batman. So it's kind of a shame that this big mystery that's supposed to be ever present until what's meant to be the biggest reveal of the franchise gets undercut by the very same narrative tools used to build it up. And now, to wrap things up, let's talk about the ending, which if you remember is locked behind completing half of Gotham's Most Wanted, with the extended ending being locked behind full completion. In essence, Batman realizes that nobody around him is safe now that his identity is known throughout the world. So he activates the Nightfall Protocol, where he's welcomed home by Alfred, at which point he just blows up the fucking building. So now we know what was meant by "this is how the Batman died." The extended cutscene involves Jim Gordon, now mayor of Gotham, talking about how things have progressed now that Batman, whose whole mission was to strike fear in the hearts of Gotham's criminals, is dead. It all ends with a scene clearly meant to mirror the murder of Bruce's parents, in which two criminals are robbing a couple. And then we see a supernatural, Batman-like figure swoop down at them. I don't hate it, but I don't particularly like it either. I get that they wanted to instill a sense of finality since they were ready to put the Arkham series to rest while also showing the player that the world will still continue and Batman had a positive effect. But I find it left things kind of unsatisfying. I mean, it kind of feels like they wanted to have their cake and eat it too. I personally would have felt better if they showed Batman's allies taking up the fight in his place. I mean, we have people like Nightwing, Robin, Oracle, and even Batwoman who didn't feature in the main story but still exists in the Arkhamverse. I think that would have been much more fulfilling as it shows that Batman's influence still lives on and there will always be someone to take up the mantle of Gotham's protector. But again, I don't hate the ending, but I don't feel like it was as conclusive as I'd have liked to see in the finale of one of the most iconic superhero game franchises ever. In terms of story, Arkham Knight does a lot right, but it's far from perfect. At the very least, I appreciate how they took it seriously this time and actually put in the love and care to make a complex, dynamic story even if the execution was a bit off sometimes. To me, this is definitely the most memorable narrative of the entire franchise. So in conclusion, I understand why Arkham Knight has its detractors, and to be fair, it was hyped up like crazy, meaning that any flaws and imperfections would be amplified tenfold due to the elevated expectations of the fans. Arkham Knight certainly has its flaws, but I'd argue that there is far more positive than negative, even when compared to the rest of the series. From a gameplay perspective, Arkham Knight is the best in my opinion. The story actually tries, and I don't think the Batmobile is as bad as people say. In my eyes, Arkham Knight is the definitive Arkham game. Say what you will, but I firmly believe that it is the best Arkham game in a series of other great games. So there you have it. That is the Arkham series in its entirety. It is amazing to see how it went from this groundbreaking Batman game, shocking the world by actually being good, and seeing how they were able to steadily ramp up the scale and the polish at the same time. Even the odd one out, Arkham Origins, was still a pretty good game and was enough to keep fans satisfied in their wait for Arkham Knight. I think the Arkham series is an example of the best kind of series, one that starts off strong and only keeps getting better. I'm glad I played through it again, and honestly, I could see myself going back to the series for a third time in the future. It's just that good. It seems there's always another reason to go back and experience the evolution of Arkham. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more. Videos like this will be coming out as fast as I can make them, and I also stream every Tuesday and Saturday at 4:30 p.m. Eastern. Follow me on Twitter for updates and memes. Once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Play the electro swing.